the Guestbook, for those of you who don't know of its manifesto and its work, we set it up 15 years ago, and it was committed from the word go to the exchange of stories between youth communities in divided countries, divided cultures. And so the motto was, and is still, exchanging stories, changing histories. And it played on the fact that in all Indo-European languages, the word, or almost all, the word for history and story is actually the same. In French, for example, histoire, raconter des histoires, tell me stories, and then faire de l'histoire, to do history. But the same word, Geschichte in German, and so on. So that was kind of an inspiration as to how story narrative can form and inform and transform, and sometimes deform history, and vice versa, the back and forth between the two. And the second sort of inspiration was a narrative exchange with strangers. And the fact that the word for stranger in Latin and many languages, hostis, for instance, is the same root as hostility and hospitality. It can mean a friend or an enemy. And the wager was, and is, how do you, through narrative, turn an enemy, an opponent, another, an alien, into a friend, through narrative imagination, empathy, and risk and daring. And then the third point I would make is that there was a recognition, and the president's work as a poet, as a statesman, as a prose writer, as a speech maker, has testified to this on countless occasions, but that stories and the exchange of stories is not just about exchanging stories of triumph, particularly, say, national stories, or indeed international stories of triumph and glory and victory and pride. That's important too, particularly in the retelling of the foundation of nations and states, but it's also the exchange of stories of woundedness, of suffering, the stories that have been forgotten, the stories of the victims that were never heard. And it's that recognition of how, a story of victory for one people can be a story of a defeat for another, and of humiliation. So I'd like to begin the conversation by asking you, President, to say a few words about how your project, Machnamh 100, addressed some of these issues of narrative hospitality.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you here and to have you here, Richard. And may I just say, because when I was speaking in Irish earlier, I welcomed you all in Irish and say I'm pleased all of the old friends and colleagues and also those interested in philosophy are here. And particularly, my son saying, but Sabina as well, we've been involved with the Young Philosophers the Award and so on. And I want to just say how pleased I am that those involved in the teaching of philosophy are able to be with us. So I wanted to just, I said that first. I have to say as well that I think the best contribution I can make to Richard's work, first of all, we should be very proud of Richard's work. I believe he is the person who more than anybody introduced very particularly the French work too. I think it's a pity maybe that the Atlantic is between us, and because it's work that remains very valuable. I have been preparing as well. I looked at his book, Radical Hospitality from Thought to Action, and I will have something I think quite controversial as far as that work is concerned to say, insofar as I want to address the context of what is described as the movement from hostility to hospitality. And I want to address the conditions that what I believe make it far more difficult than it was even in the times when I was taking your question about Machnamh. I remember Machnamh was really born in this room here, the room next door, after a meeting with the committee that were responsible for commemorations. And it wasn't clear as to what was coming, but I was very, very conscious of the idea of the distinction between simple eventing. There's a kind of horsemanship that's associated with eventing. But we were coming to the same thing in relation to commemorations, not just in Ireland, but in Europe, where you had to have an event, and then you said, isn't it great, it all went well, and so forth. And I thought it needed more consideration than that. And, for example, how were you to interpret, for example, the distinction between memory, a conscious public act of memory, social memory, what is in the collective memory, and then how you make transitions to making choices where you say that we're going to commemorate this rather than that, and so forth. And then you got to these. So I wanted to address all of these issues. So from the very beginning then, and Machnamh, what I was interested in doing was asking people within the historiography how they had come to their different interpretations of events, and also beyond the historiography, what had been excluded, particularly in relation, for example, the role of women, and the role, unfortunately, something that is not solved yet, although things are a bit better, the elimination of social class from Irish historiography. When I say that as well, that when I look at the good side that came out of that in many ways, and this is, I have a different interpretation of, for example, the example you have given in relation to from South Africa, where the widow of somebody who was tortured, in fact, touches the hand of the torturer. I have a different reading on that, by the way, in a way. I think in it is at the heart of nearly everything that I have to say. And that is, I think we must be very careful not to become entrapped into a kind of abstraction, as if these are in fact just simply academic issues. They're not. The circumstances in which we are meeting this morning are very particular. The speech given by President Trump at the United Nations General Assembly is a unique historic event. It is an extraordinary event that people listened to it and so forth and are still in great confusion as to how to respond. Our own Taoiseach has distanced himself from it, which I very much welcome. But a very elderly priest yesterday said to me, sitting next to me at a funeral I was attending, "Did anybody walk out?" And I said, "Not to my knowledge." And I believe that we're in conditions where the elementary etiquette of discourse that has been assumed by neoliberalism and by its alternatives, in fact, no longer prevails. You're having a very new version. And I think I have, looking back on my own work, I'm 84 after all, when I think back on it, I think it is associated with Irish history too. The role of the church, in particular in 30s, 50s, elsewhere. The inability to handle the question of the state, we've all been through that. The confusion of the distinction between religiosity and spirituality and so forth. And then when you come to it, how do you address this? Why do I hold this view? The discourse has changed. The media has changed. And as well as that, I think it has brought me back to a root philosophical question, and one different to Kant. When I gave my first speeches as President of Ireland, I remember well using those phrases, what can we know? What must we do? How to act? And so forth. When I was doing that, I have ended up reading about the division between Paul Ricard and Derrida in relation to the distinction between absolute hospitality and conditional hospitality. But I think it's deeper than that. I think the person that now where I am now is with the doorknob. I thought I resisted in most of my speeches getting to an Adorno moment, that is of the deep pessimism, that we would come to a form. I think the valuable work of that school very much, for example, making the important addition that domination is more than just simply economic exploitation or whatever, that domination is. And I think we are, in fact, we do not have an adequate discourse to deal with the impact of technology as a new form of domination in our lives. The people, for example, that are welcome on television, which is not any longer publicly owned. It is owned by a number of oligarchs. It is equally in relation, there isn't very much, not that I want to suppress anything, but I'll just say the last thing that I had in many cases, people even about in relation to the project yourself, about which I so agree with and that, I think it's very, very difficult to talk about exchanging narratives, when in fact what is at stake is this, not any kind of dialogue with competing narratives, but the suppression of intercultures. The 19th century gave us a legacy of imperialism that suppressed hundreds of languages, several traditions, cultures, and we were afraid to call it out very often. And thus, to me, when people say, for example, about it, it is a matter of getting the opposites to talk to each other, it's a very limited road, and you could end up actually as a kind of an apologetic, evasive action in the face of competing fascism. And that is a real danger. Where we are now, I think, is, we have to mention, but to my point about the kind of capitalism, it's very different in a way, because it's now delivered into our lives through technology. Let me put it simpler. The realm of accountability has shrunk. The realm of unaccountability with new instruments is ever more threatening. And therefore, what should we do? And I think our discourse in a way, it can't be rather like the Derrida, Ricard one about, for example, the meaning of hospitality. I also question my good friend Luke Gibbons' notion, which is, I think, that it is modernity only is the problem, and that in previous forms of cultures there was an inherent hospitality. I think it's a nice idea, but I would like to see anthropological investigation of it in different circumstances. Now,
very good. Well, it reminds me what you're saying there, President, of the importance of the critique of ideology, as your friend Habermas put it,
yes.
That no story is innocent. No narrative comes from nowhere. You know, there are all kinds of presuppositions of power, and as Edward Said put it, when you talk about narrate, you've got to ask, who has permission to narrate? Who gets the right to narrate? Who is given voice?
Well, that's very much my point, Richard, because why haven't we been speaking about power?
Yes. Power is absolutely crucial here. And power invests narrative in all kinds of ways, and when it does, it dissimulates itself as it dominates. So I think the exchange of narrative is not just about some benign, optimistic, utopian exchange of views. It's a recognition that there is this labor of the negative going on in narrativity as well, that as many lies are being told as many truths. So the critical aspect, absolutely indispensable. But I'd like to go from there to the question of how far can you go with narration without explaining things away? And where does one have to stop and say, we must here respect silence?
Well, it's a very good question to put to me, because there were many people who suggested to me that a president should stay silent. And I couldn't begin to tell you the list of subjects upon which people. I found myself asking somebody yesterday the name of the original authors which I read in the 1960s when I was in the United States on the authoritarian personality. Adorno and others was one of them. Where did it come from? And I do think it's worth thinking as well. You mentioned Habermas. His vision of Europe is tragically over, and I so wish him well in his mid-90s as he is now. But he acknowledged himself, I think, that when he was speaking, for example, about the wasteful competition between the sources of the transcendent, is that he was really speaking about European Christianity. And he was therefore limited in relation to that. That was going to crumble anyway. And then also as well, I think a flaw that was shared with the human rights movement of the 1990s is that it was Eurocentric. It is fascinating the number of scholars that I have met recently, only a few, who are aware of all the other, going back from the Code of Hammurabi and the other, the cultures of Africa, Asia, South America, the different remote areas that had in fact codes of right, codes of justice. You can think, for example, notions of the good person among the Barotse, all of these. And yet the assumption, I think very much, in Nisha McSweeney's book on the bogus, that the West. And what is this West? It is, of course, a construction. Are there any people other than white equal people in ancient Athens? Of course it was full of there were slaves and there were others, but also there were people of different races. Now, I found that in relation to, if I want to move a discussion from hostility to hospitality, I must really say, why have I said it has become in danger of becoming an abstraction? I say this because I saw it happen in the subject I worked on most of my life, sociology. The 19th century is the century of Marx and Weber and Durkheim and so on. And we remember, even at that time of teaching for young sociology students, they used to teach a module called socialization, of how you got society into the young students and so on. It was all based on 6 major studies built around Princeton, Gabriel Armand, Lucian Pye, people like that. The idea is that modernity was what? Being defined in a linear way, ethnocentric way, in a way that it kind of constructed notions of the modern versus the traditional, the urban versus the agricultural, and that it was all, and we went to the United States, people like Orlando Falls-Boda, myself and others, to realize how our societies were backward but could be changed if certain things could be removed. And that's immediately, if there are other people who criticize Michael Higgins would mean to say, but haven't we come a long way? Oh yes, we have come a long way by avoiding some fundamental issues of the relationship between economy, social justice, human rights, ecology. And who today are making these arguments, even at the General Assembly? All the strong places those strong speeches on those issues are coming from what the Europe calls the South. But Europe is unable to, in fact, talk about the South in a way that encourages any dialogue, because it has not addressed its own history in relation to its imperialism, colonization, subjugation of cultures, wiping out. Like in May, I said we must address the founding of our own state, the founding of the War of Independence. I have repeatedly suggested this, that the best way of having a conversation with the problems facing Africa is to face history. So how did this happen as well? I mentioned the big figures. I now see how Max Weber is the one I neglected possibly, because mixed with an uncritical new form of capitalism with its new kind of degradations is the rise of a technocracy. So therefore, within that alliance of technocracy and unaccountable capital, you get the latest, which is a kind of taking off the mask and saying the kind of things that were said at the United Nations General Assembly. And that people immediately then in relation, how have people handled this historically? Well, it's to our great credit and why we have democracy, is in fact the people said we're not accepting it. But how do you deal with the kind of numbness that says, I have a way of making anyone who objects impoverished? We are all locked into a motif that suggests that trade is more important than life or rights. And if you sit there and say that, then one is acquiescing. No more then, for example, both of us are scholars who have dealt with the concept of memory. How, you might say, if you were a German at the moment, if you were living in Germany, was it a good idea to say that every child ever born in Germany again will be told the story of it? They should, of course, but are you to say to them that you're to do so without the necessary warning as to numbing you to it ever happening again? Look at Primo Levi's statement, for example, as he said, so that it may never happen again. But yet, at the same time, there are countries in Europe, they're not necessarily, sometimes they're not representative of their populations, who refuse to see anything wrong with genocide, to use the word, in fact, to look at, for example, emaciated children, mothers feeding children deprived of water and so forth. And this raises the other thing, which I think comes out of this book, which was, I was looking at it again last night, which is a very good book, but it's, who is it that has the situation? It's Kant, actually, Immanuel Kant, that makes the phrase that dignity is not a condescension, but dignity is a right. Well, now, if the Palestinian people, for example, have the rights to independence that other people enjoyed after the First World War, how can you say that their right must be negotiated with the people who are responsible for overreaction? I have immediately to say, I have condemned again and again the actions of October the 7th, but that's not where history, the long history is in relation to whether you accept it as a right or not. People say that so-and-so is going to issue a statement, somebody else is going to issue a statement. The fact of the matter, when I look at the Machnamh correspondence with Hussein, for example, at the foundation of the State of Israel, with a set of conditions attached and the rest of it, one of the things that they are, 80% of the population at the moment on the ground, farming, some are Bedouins, some are others, are in fact actually what they're less than 20% are people of Jewish faith. How are we to describe them? The British protectorate says we'll just say non-Jewish. So you call the 80% non-Jewish. And you then, to this day, as I have had experience in good Gaza and the West Bank and so on, where I found it difficult to have good people who were having a change that might have moved from hostility to hospitality. And they cannot say the word Palestinian. They say no. That you're talking about Judea and Samaria and so forth. So what are you to do when you have come to a point? I'm only describing it as the depth of the challenge. Is we have come to this point of so many comprehensive evasions that I think that you can say many things about Kant doing. But one of the things that my very first speeches, when I quoted those speeches, the assumption was of a universal order, of a universality that could accommodate and include all of this diversity I describe, be it in terms of gender and culture and so forth. And then as I come on in many ways, see, I watched what happened after the 19th century concentration on Marxism, anti-Marxism, in relation to macro theory, shifting into micro theory, and in its most useless form, assisted by, I think, postmodernism, something called ethnomethodology within micros. And what it all was fiddling with what it is safe, as one avoided is in fact the exercise and distribution of power. And that now is made manifest in relation to the question of, the whole question about, yes, there is capacity. You hear the moment, which is universalism at its best, when you have the universal development goals, commitment to new forms of agriculture, production, consumption, and so on. You can actually feel, I did, And I was glad to have been president in that period when there was a kind of a sense of hope. But there is so much the scholarship in many. Look at where you were where you will return to the United States, which is witnessing the destruction of its universities. You have equally in the case of in the United Kingdom next door. You've just luckily a judge has struck down the definition of terrorism. You equally in relation to other areas. Think of the important words. Freedom. It is not freedom from hunger we speak of now. It is not freedom to have access to different cultures, not freedom of movement. No, the point is to ensure our freedom. We must deepen our scarcities on the most vulnerable so that we can, in fact, be more lethal. And remember Huntington, that I told you he's still on the road, what Huntington's remarks were. In order to be free, you must know who the opponent is. And thus, and then that. And that it has to be faced and addressed.
Absolutely. This Sevo indignatio comes to mind as I hear you. And you're a descendant of Swift in your savage indignation about these injustices that are being committed and have been committed for so long. In terms of narrative hospitality, you have, in your speeches, in your teachings, as you've just spoken now, in your many collections of essays and prose works, I made a little list earlier, Power to the People, When Ideas Matter, Causes for Concern, Restoring the European Street, remember that one?
Yeah.
Reviewing the Republic. You have written so powerfully in prose, telling stories and challenging stories of power, and done it so remarkably well, giving us all an example of moral leadership and moral imagination. And then there's another kind of language, another kind of storytelling, which you have also engaged in and excelled in, and that's a different kind of power. It's maybe the power of the powerless, because if narratives in prose tell history as it happened, as it actually happened, narratives in poetry tell it as if it happened, or in fiction, as if it happened in this way or that way. And I'm very interested in seeing how your prose work as a critique of power links, if it does, and this is my question to you, with your poetry. In your new and selected poems, in your new spoken poetry project, where there's a different kind of power at work, isn't there? The power of the powerless. And I'd like to ask you about that.
I so often see in the poetry I read and in the attempts I make, my own writing and the rest of it, I am actually struggling with images that are not contemporary, and narrative is a difficult word to put it because recalled events and also the experiences and so on are going to surface in your life in different ways, sometimes in terms of near despair and depression and so forth. I would say that across the disciplines that I know and the scholars whose work I've read, and I thought, curiously, it was in Palestine I met the woman who had done the big study. And she had said, children in Palestine, it was after the building of the dividing wall, which of course the International Court has condemned. And she said, children are so affected by the humiliation of their parents that it is affecting them later in traumatic terms more than the death of either parent. Of course, we now have to come where you have so many people with no adult at all looking after them, and you have 42,000 amputees in Gaza and so forth. It will get worse. But sticking to my point about memory, I think that is the very interesting thing about poetry. In many ways has a sensibility that is not limited to what is conventional narrative. So there is such a thing as the poetic instinct, but then there's also a different thing in relation to the crafting and the making of the poem, which is affected by, again, different circumstances. And I think that when that is happening, it is about the allowing of what I call the agoniste, the agony of existence and contradiction to find its expression in different ways. Many of the art forms, I think, for example, in relation to contemporary dance, in relation to different forms of theatre, this is different forms indeed, theatre and the Stanislavski myth and others can do. So it's a matter of this. And then if you are inevitably going to have to face the fundamental questions then about the location of that confused life in the long version of time. And when I speak about, therefore, I immediately move into then to a consideration of the concept of transcendence. And if you actually try and deal with the concept of transcendence in a full anthropological way, in an adequate ethical way, you're then immediately, you might, as I would say in many cases, may all prophets be listened to, but may they speak of peace. But yet it is something that I'm back now very nearly to where Habermas didn't go. And I think Derrida has it in another piece of his work. If you're to judge what are the consequences of these systems of transcendence in different ways, is that there weren't, just as I described it, there were attempts to be singular powers. So it would have been a very good beginning. You asked me about my poem. When I wrote my poem, for example, The Prophets Are Weeping, I meant very deliberately what I think was influenced me in writing that particular time was all the atrocities in the names of founding figures of so-called spirituality and so forth, and what had been delivered. And it would be my advice to the Pope at present in many ways, that it call a meeting of the heads of these doctrinal systems to say we acknowledge the horror that has been done in the way of imposed absolutisms of transcendence and belief. About the poems too, in many ways, it was when sometimes I have lost many poems because sometimes they come to me at night and I don't get up and write them. I will cover a fragment of them the following day. And it's hoping I intend to go back to there. I have some unfinished projects that are good. But it is a very, there's a last point I'll make about it is in relation to the concept of the sacral.
Yes.
In many cases, recently I've been writing a bit just for myself about this, is that I think it is, he's now a professor in Berkeley, but I remember him writing about this. What happens when a person says they're encountering the sacral, and in terms, they have a sense of awe? Well, the awe requires a kind of a penumbra of mysterium around the source of the awe. And if you go too close, the mysterium disappears, and it is no longer for you a source of awe. In many ways, it is interesting too, is that I think the more some gerontologists would say very even late in life in many cases, people have different strategies of addressing this. For example, a person would say, near death would say, I'll travel now. And they begin, in fact, to have encounters through the past that they had in different ways and so forth. But that then is in relation to what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting an animate notion that is continuing past physical life? Very many writers and creators, in fact, draw on that strength, as it were, about that nothing is ever forgotten truly. And therefore, in fact, so far as it is left by way of being there, by way of recall. Hence, you'll notice in symbolism and the creative arts of leaving a stone on stone and so on. Yeah.
Well, we don't have much more time, but I'd just like to make maybe a final comment, and perhaps it's a question too, about the two voices of Michael D. Higgins.
Yeah.
As president and politician on the one hand, a statesman,
Yeah.
and as then a poet and a person. And I was rereading some of your recent poems in Against Certainty, which I think is a wonderful title, because very often politics looks for certainty and ideology looks for certainty, but poetry goes somewhere else. That is what you describe in one of your poems, the fragile truth of poetry. So that fragile truth that you bear witness to in so many of the poems in this recent spoken poetry collection, the Against Certainty. And rereading last night, my mother married my father in Mellery in 1937. And that voice of Michael D. Higgins is coming from another place, as you described it, the place of waking in the middle of the night, the unconscious, the body, the dancer, the image of the dancer you mentioned. And it's what I mentioned earlier, the power of the powerless. It's another kind of powerless. Seamus Heaney said, you know, a poem never stopped a tank, but it works in another kind of way that's just as powerful. It's maybe not the language of political justice and rage and protest,
it isn't quite.
It's indispensable.
The difference between, for example, Swift and Reg, that we correct, is a compliment in many ways. It is that I actually know that an alternative is possible.
Yeah.
For example, the new writing in ecology and economics, social justice, and so forth, Mario Mazzucato, so many others. There's Piketty and others. And also the trade union movement, stuff in Europe and elsewhere. The profile of alternatives is there, and I recognize it, and I pay tribute to it. But I think it is interesting. I'll say this, that books have been very important to me in my life, because as the different circumstances of my father and mother and my aunts and uncles, my mother kept bringing the books with her that she had in many ways. So there was always that. But I don't think, and it is true of my brother and my sisters as well, is the way that we were in our different exclusions too, dealing with. If you acquired an interesting piece, you wanted to share it. And that is the difference in a way between the kind of politics, the idea as well. Sabina and I, for example, must have addressed thousands of meetings in different places, but not just for party politics, but for all of the protests or whatever. And the idea is why I wrote in my poem in tribute to Mary McPartland of Saturdays Made Holy. Yeah. It was that idea that in many cases, that you had it and you were going to share it. Yes. And that is the difference between some. So, have you access? Well, have you got this app, or have you? That's the difference. I don't think any of the philosophers that we've mentioned favor a neat distinction between the public and the private, because you can't retain the concept of sensibility. And this later work, for example, that would work on the tactile and others that. But what the world now needs is courage and commitment to take a stand against what is unfortunately using wrongly the tools and resources of science and technology in a way that endangers the planet and future generations. But more importantly, I will say about those things, marching behind, as I did in the poem in honor of Mary McPartland, when I said, I think as well, what are all of us looking back then? There are many arrows that have been fired in the history of philosophy. There are many wonderful contributions in relation to the utopian tradition and the power of a different kind of ethics, and the wonderful opportunities that are there for, if you like, making universal the concept of dignity, but also of making a case for sufficiency. Look at the idea of 3 or 4 people saying, you know, I think the Pope has said, I'm the richest person, and so is the second richest. In what sense of what they do? And people have to be able to, even as you mentioned Swift, using dark sarcasm, but it will never be enough, because irony, as we will know from the history of the world, is in fact never sufficient. And I think what you have to do is in fact actually to describe the outlines of the possible. And I think that that's wonderful. I think I took that very, very much, I think, when I was reading John O'Donoghue's work for the first time, very much when he says, in many cases when you come into the end of life, people say, will you be able to sum up this film? Can you tell us what was your most favorite film, whatever? In fact, actually, all of the possibilities are what's important, because it's a wider category than the visual, and it is able to draw on all of the senses, not one. And it is like as if it was a sedimentation in life. So in a person, the recovery of a life is not the recovery of what can be spoken about or what can be recovered as what was seen, but most important, what was envisaged as possibility. And that is so much better than vague notions of false hope.
Wonderful. And I would just end with this sentence, which is to repeat your line from that poem you dedicated to Patrick Hederman, where you describe the fragile truth of poetry as unquenchable possibility.
Yes.
And we've often talked about the power of anticipatory memory, all those possible memories.
And it needs the breath of courage to keep the fire alive.
Correct. So I'm very grateful to you, and I'm sure we all are very grateful to you, for always speaking in those two voices and bearing witness to those two voices of the political on the one hand and the poetic on the other, so eloquently and so courageously.
Thank you, Richard.